3 days after they buried her husband, she loaded his revolver, pressed it to her temple, and her hand cramped. Not courage, not God, just a muscle spasm. That's what kept Penelope Edwards alive. She spent 5 months turning herself to ice, feeling nothing, needing no one. Then a quiet cowboy walked into her store, bought 3 peppermint sticks for brothers he'd never see again, and never once asked her to smile. But the man who murdered her husband on their wedding night? He just rode into town, wearing a gentleman's suit and a killer's smile. This story teaches us that healing doesn't come from someone saving you. It comes from someone showing up, again and again, with small kindnesses, until you remember you're strong enough to save yourself. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk, where the Wild West tells stories of shattered hearts finding warmth again, of love that doesn't rescue but stands beside you, and of the quiet courage it takes to feel something after you've lost everything. If this story stirred something in your heart, hit that like button, subscribe to Cowboy Dusk, and ring that bell, so every story finds its way to you.
Penelope Edwards knew exactly which bullet killed her husband. It was not the one that punched through the hotel window on their wedding night. It was not the one that tore through Thomas Edwards and left him bleeding on the floor while the music from the saloon next door kept playing like nothing had happened. No. The bullet that truly killed everything was the one Penelope loaded into Thomas's Colt revolver 3 days after the funeral, pressed against her own temple, and could not fire. Her hand had cramped. Not courage, not hope. Just a muscle spasm that saved her life, if you could call what came after living. 5 months later, she stood at his grave on a Tuesday afternoon in September of 1878, watching the late summer sun burn low over the Sonoma Hills, and she felt nothing at all. The headstone read, Thomas James Edwards, beloved husband, born 1852, died April 1878. 4 hours. That was how long their marriage had lasted. 4 hours between I do and the sound of shattering glass and a bullet that the sheriff said came from a saloon fight next door. Wrong place, wrong time, bad luck. Penelope had nodded when they told her, signed whatever papers they put in front of her, watched them lower the pine box into the ground. And then she had walked to the general store on Main Street in Petaluma, California, asked Mrs. Henderson for a job, and begun the slow, careful work of turning herself to ice. Petaluma was not a big town, but it was growing. The dairy ranches spread across the rolling green hills of Sonoma County sent butter and cheese down to San Francisco on ox-drawn wagons that creaked through the main road twice a week. The stagecoach came through every Tuesday and Friday. There was a white-painted wooden church with peeling clapboard siding, 2 saloons, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a hotel that had seen better days, and Henderson's general store where Penelope spent 6 days a week counting inventory, sweeping floors, and speaking only when the transaction required it. She walked back from the cemetery now along the dirt road that cut through the center of town. The road was cracked and dry from summer heat, and dust rose with every step and settled on the hem of her gray dress. 3 women standing outside the millinery shop turned when they saw her coming. Martha Pruitt, the banker's wife, took a half-step forward with that particular expression people wore when they wanted to offer sympathy but did not know how. Penelope gave her a nod so cold that Martha stepped back as though she had been slapped. The other 2 women looked at their shoes. Penelope kept walking. She did not slow down. She did not feel guilt. Every kind word was a crack in the dam she had built inside herself, and Penelope could not afford cracks. Cracks led to feeling, and feeling led to the kind of pain that made a woman load a revolver and press it to her head. The store smelled the way it always did, dried tobacco and leather, and the faint sweetness of penny candy in glass jars along the front counter. Mrs. Ida Henderson stood behind the register, a stout woman of 62 with silver hair pinned in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen enough sorrow to recognize it in others. She had lost her own husband at Antietam during the war. She never spoke of it unless asked, and nobody asked anymore. "Good afternoon, dear," Mrs. Henderson said when Penelope came through the door. Penelope nodded once. She hung her shawl on the hook by the back room and began unpacking a crate of canned peaches that had arrived on the morning wagon. She worked in silence, her hands quick and sure, her face empty. Mrs. Henderson watched her the way she always did, with a careful, quiet concern that she had learned not to voice. She had tried once in those first weeks to talk to Penelope about grief, about healing, about the possibility that the pain might ease with time. Penelope had looked at her with eyes so flat and dead that Mrs. Henderson had stopped mid-sentence and never brought it up again. Instead, the old woman left small kindnesses where Penelope might find them. A plate of fresh biscuits near her work area. A cup of coffee left on the counter still warm. A new pair of stockings folded beside the register with no note attached. Penelope never acknowledged these gifts. She never refused them either. She simply let them exist in the space between them, unclaimed. Today, Mrs. Henderson had placed a biscuit and a small jar of preserves on the shelf near the peach crates. Penelope saw them and said nothing. She kept unpacking. Around midday, a letter arrived. The postman brought it in with the usual bundle of correspondence, and Mrs. Henderson sorted through the pile while Penelope helped a rancher's wife select fabric for a new dress. When Penelope glanced over a few minutes later, Henderson was reading a single-page letter with an expression that did not match anything Penelope had seen on the old woman's face before. Something between fear and resolve. Then Henderson noticed Penelope looking. She folded the letter quickly, 3 times over, and stuffed it into the pocket of her apron. Her hands were steady, but only because she gripped the apron tight. Penelope looked away and returned to her work. It was not her business. Nothing was her business anymore except canned goods and inventory counts, and the slow passage of hours until she could return to her room and lie in the dark. But something nagged at her. A small thing. Mrs. Henderson's hands had trembled when she folded that letter, and Penelope had never, in 5 months of working beside her, seen Mrs. Henderson's hands tremble. The rest of the day passed without incident. Penelope closed the store at 6, swept the floors, counted the register, and walked the 2 blocks to the seamstress shop where she rented the room above. The stairs were narrow and dark. The room was small. A bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, a window that looked out over the alley behind the building. She ate a piece of bread with butter and drank water from the pitcher on the washstand. She did not light a lamp. She sat on the edge of the bed in the gray light and listened to the sounds of the town settling into evening. Laughter from one of the saloons, a dog barking somewhere, the distant low of cattle from the ranches outside town. Then she opened the nightstand drawer. Thomas's Colt lay there the way it always did. She had cleaned it once, a week after the funeral. Oiled it. Checked the cylinder. 6 rounds all loaded. She had not touched it since. But she looked at it every night, not with longing exactly, not with intent, more like a traveler checking to make sure the road home still existed, even if she had no plans to walk it. The gun was her last exit. The knowledge that it was there, loaded and waiting, gave her a sense of control that nothing else in her life provided. She had lost her parents to cholera when she was 19, lost her brother Michael to a horse accident when she was 21, lost her husband to a stray bullet when she was 23. She could not control any of that. But the Colt in the drawer was a choice she could make if the darkness ever became too complete. She closed the drawer. She lay down. She stared at the ceiling and waited for exhaustion to claim her the way it did every night, slowly and without mercy. Sleep came eventually. It always did. And in the morning the whole thing started again. She was up before dawn, dressed in the same gray dress she wore most days, hair braided and pinned tight against her skull. She walked to the store in the thin light of early morning, the streets still empty except for a stray cat slinking along the boardwalk. When she reached the store and pulled the key from her pocket, she noticed something she had not expected. A horse tied to the hitching post out front. A tall buckskin gelding with a Morrison Ranch brand on its hip, still saddled, still breathing hard like it had been ridden in from the country. And standing beside it, a man she had never seen before. He was tall and lean, built the way men get when they spend their days in the saddle and their nights sleeping on the ground. Trail dust covered him like a second skin, layered into the creases of his denim trousers and the seams of his leather vest. His hat was pulled low, but not low enough to hide his face. And when he turned at the sound of her boots on the boardwalk, she saw his eyes. They were the color of creek water in summer, somewhere between green and brown depending on the light. But that was not what she noticed first. What she noticed first was the look behind them. It was the look of a man running from something, not panicked, not wild, just watchful in the way that a person becomes when they have been looking over their shoulder for a long time and cannot stop. Penelope recognized that look. She saw it every morning in her mirror. "Morning, ma'am," the stranger said. He held his hat in his hands and stood with the balanced, easy stance of someone comfortable in his own body. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from practice rather than nature. "Store open yet?" Penelope looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. "It will be in a minute," she said, and her voice carried nothing. No warmth, no curiosity, no invitation. Just the flat, professional tone of a woman doing her job. She stepped inside and did not look back to see if he followed. Austin Jennings had used 3 different names in the past 2 years. In a mining camp outside Reno, he had been Jack Talbot. In a cattle town south of Sacramento, he had been William Crane. In Petaluma, he used his real name for the first time since leaving Colorado, and the sound of it coming off his own tongue made him feel both lighter and more afraid than he had been in months. There was a risk in using his real name. He knew that. But he was tired. Tired of remembering which lie he had told in which town. Tired of sleeping with one eye open and his boots on. Tired of the weight of a folded piece of paper at the bottom of his saddlebag that could end his freedom if the wrong person ever read it. He had come to Petaluma because it was far enough from Colorado to feel safe and small enough to disappear in. Sonoma County was dairy country, rolling green hills dotted with cattle and sheep. Not the kind of place that attracted bounty hunters or federal marshals. The kind of place a man might settle into quietly and be forgotten. Hank Morrison had hired him that same morning. The rancher was a big man in his middle 50s with a weathered face and a handshake that could crush walnuts. Civil War veteran, Union side, the kind of man who measured others by their work and not their words. He had taken one look at Austin and said, "You know horses?" Austin said he did. Morrison pointed to the breaking pen where a half-wild Mustang was running circles, foam at its mouth, eyes rolling white. "Show me." What followed was 15 minutes of dust and noise and the kind of work that separated real cowboys from pretenders. Austin did not fight the horse. He stepped into the pen with slow, deliberate movements, letting the animal see him, letting it smell him, letting it run itself tired against the rails. When the Mustang finally stopped, sides heaving, Austin walked to it with one hand extended, palm up, and waited. The horse snorted, stamped, took a step closer. Austin did not move. He just stood there, patient as a fence post, until the animal's nose touched his palm. Then he spoke low and even, words that meant nothing, except in the tone they carried. And within 10 minutes he had a halter on the Mustang, and was leading it in slow circles around the pen. The vaqueros on the fence rails whistled and clapped. A woman standing near the water trough, dark-haired and sharp-eyed with the weathered look of someone who spent her days outdoors, called out to him in a voice that carried clear across the yard. "You running from something?" Austin looked at her. She was maybe 30, Mexican by heritage, wearing a practical riding skirt and a man's cotton shirt rolled to the elbows. Her name, he would learn later, was Rosa Delgado. Her husband was one of Morrison's vaqueros. "Everyone here is running from something," Rosa said before he could answer. She smiled, but her eyes were measuring him the way a good horse trader measures stock. "Don't worry, we don't ask too many questions." Morrison hired him on the spot. Good pay, a cot in the bunkhouse, meals at the communal kitchen. Hard work, but honest work. The kind that left a man tired enough to sleep without dreaming. That afternoon, Morrison sent him into town for supplies. Austin rode the buckskin into Petaluma's main street with a list in his pocket, and the careful alertness of a man entering unfamiliar territory. He tied up outside Henderson's general store and waited for the woman he had seen unlocking the door that morning. When she let him in, he stepped inside and took the measure of the place. Clean, well-stocked, organized in the particular way that spoke of someone who cared about precision. Shelves lined with canned goods and dry goods and tools, barrels of flour and sugar and nails, a glass case near the register holding tobacco and small luxuries. And there she was, standing on a wooden ladder near the back wall, reaching for something on a high shelf. Her back was to him, and he could see the line of her spine through the fabric of her gray dress, straight as a rifle barrel. Her dark hair was braided tight against her head, not a strand out of place. Everything about her was controlled, contained, locked down. When she turned and looked at him from the ladder, he saw her face clearly for the first time. It was a face that might have been beautiful if anything at all were happening behind it. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark eyes that should have been striking, but instead were flat and empty, like a house with every lamp blown out. Dark windows staring at nothing. Austin recognized that look. He had worn it himself for a solid year after scarlet fever took his parents and two younger brothers in the space of 3 weeks in Trinidad, Colorado. He had looked in the mirror during that time and seen exactly what he saw now on this woman's face. The complete absence of anything resembling hope. "I will be with you in a moment," she said from the ladder. Her voice was professional, flat, a voice designed to conduct transactions and nothing else. "No rush, ma'am," Austin said, and he meant it. He stood by the counter and waited with the same patience he had shown the Mustang and the braking pen. She came down the ladder and faced him. Up close, her eyes were darker than he had thought, nearly black, and there were shadows beneath them that spoke of too many nights without real sleep. "How may I help you?" she said. It was not a question. It was a formality. Austin pulled the supply list from his shirt pocket and handed it across the counter, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Need some supplies. Just hired on at the Morrison Ranch, north of town. Foreman sent me in for a few things." She took the list and scanned it with quick, efficient eyes. Coffee, sugar, tobacco, ammunition, rope, a new set of horseshoes, standard ranch supplies. She moved through the store with practiced ease, pulling items from shelves and bins, assembling everything on the counter without wasted motion. Austin watched her work and thought about wounded animals. The kind you found sometimes on the trail, a deer with a broken leg, a hawk with a damaged wing. Animals that had been hurt badly enough that their whole body had reorganized around the injury, every movement compensating, every instinct redirected toward one purpose: survival. That was what he was looking at. A woman who had rebuilt herself entirely around a wound. And the rebuilding had been so thorough that there was nothing left of whoever she had been before. "That will be $4.30, she said, everything laid out neat on the counter. Austin counted out the money. Then he paused and looked at the glass jar near the front window. Peppermint sticks, red and white, standing in a cluster like a tiny forest. "You have peppermint sticks," he said, "in the jar by the window, 2 cents each." He walked to the jar and stood there longer than made sense. His jaw tightened. He reached in and selected 3, held them in his hand for a moment that stretched just a beat too long, then brought them to the counter and added the coins. The woman did not ask why a grown man was buying 3 peppermint sticks. She did not ask anything at all. She just took his money, made change, and turned away before he had finished loading his saddlebags. "Appreciate your help, ma'am," Austin said. "You have a good day now." She nodded without turning around. He gathered his things and walked to the door. On the boardwalk, he paused and glanced back through the window glass. She had already returned to the high shelf, her back to the store, shelving canned goods with mechanical precision. He should leave this town. He knew that. Should ride out before anyone connected the name Austin Jennings to the wanted circular that might or might not be tacked to the notice board beside this very store. should keep running the way he had been running for 2 years, one town to the next, never staying long enough to care about anything or anyone. But something about the woman in the store, all that steel wrapped around all that damage, made him want to stay long enough to see if the lamps behind those dead eyes ever came back on. As he stepped off the boardwalk, he nearly collided with a man standing in front of the notice board beside the store entrance. The man was studying the posted bills with the careful attention of someone looking for something specific. He glanced at Austin, then back at the board. Austin kept walking. Did not look back, did not run, but the skin between his shoulder blades went cold, and it stayed cold all the way back to Morrison Ranch. That night in the bunkhouse, Austin pulled his saddlebag close and reached to the very bottom where a folded piece of paper lived, worn soft at the creases from being checked and rechecked 100 times. He did not open it. He did not need to. He knew every word by heart. He also knew that if anyone in Petaluma ever read that paper, the quiet life he was trying to build would end before it began. He shoved the bag under his cot and lay back, staring at the rough timber ceiling, listening to the other ranch hands snoring and shifting in their sleep. He thought about a woman with dead eyes shelving canned goods. He thought about peppermint sticks and little brothers who would never eat them again. He thought about how far Colorado was from California, and whether it was far enough. He should ride out at dawn. He knew that. But for the first time in 2 years, Austin Jennings did not want to run. November in Sonoma Valley did not kill with snow the way Colorado did. It killed with a wet cold that crept into the bones and stayed there, settled in deep like grief, like something that had no intention of leaving. The fog came every morning now, rolling in from the coast and filling the valley floor until the town of Petaluma seemed to float in a sea of white. The dairy farms surrounding the town sent their milk wagons creaking through the mist, and the smell of fresh cream mixed with wood smoke from 100 chimneys, to create something that should have been comforting, but only made Penelope Edwards feel more alone. Austin Jennings came for supplies every Wednesday. By his 3rd week, Penelope had stopped pretending she did not notice the pattern. By his 4th week, she had stopped pretending she did not look toward the door around mid-morning, listening for the sound of boots on the boardwalk and the particular way he said, "No rush, ma'am," when she told him she would be a moment. She hated that she noticed. Hated the tiny flicker of something that was not quite warmth, but was not quite nothing either. The flicker that appeared in her chest when he walked through the door. She had spent 5 months building a wall of ice inside herself, and she was not about to let some trail-dusty cowboy with sad eyes and a sweet tooth put cracks in it. But the cracks were forming anyway, whether she wanted them or not. It happened on a gray Thursday afternoon, when the fog had not lifted all day and the store was quiet. Mrs. Henderson had gone home early with a cough she could not shake, leaving Penelope alone behind the counter. The door opened around 2 o'clock, and a man walked in that Penelope had never seen. He was big, unshaven, wearing a long coat that had not been washed in weeks. He smelled of whiskey and the road. His eyes moved over the store the way a dog's eyes moved over a kitchen, looking for what he could take. He picked up a tin of sardines and turned it over in his hands. Put it back. Picked up a pouch of tobacco and sniffed it. His eyes found Penelope behind the counter and stayed there. A slow smile spread across his face that had nothing to do with friendliness. "All alone today, sweetheart," he said. Penelope felt the familiar cold settle over her. Not fear. She had used up most of her capacity for fear in the months after Thomas died. What she felt was anger, clear and bright, rising through the ice like a flame through frost. "Can I help you with something?" she said. Her voice was flat, professional. The man walked closer. He put his hands on the counter and leaned forward close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Maybe you can," he said. "Maybe you can help me with something real nice." Penelope did not step back. She reached beneath the counter where Mrs. Henderson kept the shotgun on 2 hooks, screwed into the wood. Her hand found the stock. She lifted it smooth and steady and brought the barrel up until it was level with the man's chest. "The door is behind you," she said. "Use it." The man's smile died. He looked at the shotgun, at her face, at the shotgun again. He must have seen something in her expression that convinced him she was not bluffing, because he took 3 steps backward, turned, and walked out the door without another word. Penelope stood behind the counter holding the shotgun with both hands. Her fingers were rock steady. Her heart was beating hard, but not from fear. From something closer to satisfaction. She had handled it, alone, without help, without needing anyone. She was still holding the gun when the door opened again 5 minutes later, and Austin Jennings walked in. He saw the shotgun immediately. His eyes went from the weapon to her face to the empty store and back. Most men would have asked if she was all right. Most men would have gone pale or made a fuss or insisted on finding the sheriff. Austin Jennings did none of those things. He looked at the way she held the shotgun and said, "You are holding the barrel a little low. Bring it up to chest height." More persuasive that way. Then he pulled his supply list from his pocket and handed it to her as though nothing unusual had happened. Penelope stared at him. For the first time in 5 months, she felt genuine surprise. He was not worried about her. He was not treating her like a fragile thing that needed protection. He had looked at her holding a shotgun and offered a practical suggestion the same way one professional might advise another. Something shifted inside her. Not warmth. Not yet. But the first hairline crack in the ice. A fracture so small you would need a magnifying glass to see it, but it was there. She put the shotgun back on its hooks and took his list. They did not speak again until the transaction was complete. Austin paid, selected his 3 peppermint sticks from the jar, and loaded his saddlebags. But as he was leaving, he paused and set something on the counter. A small paper-wrapped bundle. "Found these in my saddlebag," he said. "Belonged to my sister back in Colorado. She left them behind when she got married. They are fingerless gloves, good wool, keep your palms warm while leaving your fingers free for work. I noticed your hands get pretty cold handling metal in this weather. Seemed a waste to leave them sitting in a bag." "I cannot accept gifts from customers," Penelope said immediately. "They are not a gift. They are surplus." Austin's expression was easy, unbothered. "But if it makes you uncomfortable, I will just leave them here. You can do whatever you want with them. Give them to Mrs. Henderson. Throw them in the stove. Up to you." He tipped his hat and walked out before she could respond. Penelope looked at the package on the counter for a long time. Then she picked it up with 2 fingers, carried it to the back room, and set it on a shelf where she would not have to see it. But that night, lying in her room above the seamstress shop, she thought about the gloves. She thought about Austin's voice when he said he had noticed her hands getting cold. He had noticed. Not in the way men sometimes notice things about women, with hunger or calculation. He had noticed the way a person notices a practical problem and offers a practical solution. That was somehow harder to dismiss than flattery would have been. The next morning, she was reorganizing the store's back room, shifting crates and boxes to make space for a new shipment, when she found something that stopped her cold. A letter, stuck behind a shelf, wedged between the wood and the wall as though it had slipped there and been forgotten. It was addressed to Mrs. Henderson in handwriting that Penelope recognized with a jolt that went through her like electricity. It was Thomas's handwriting. She pulled the letter free with trembling hands. The envelope was unsealed, the paper inside folded once. It was dated 2 weeks before their wedding. Most of it was mundane. Store orders, inventory notes, a question about whether Henderson had received a particular shipment. But one line near the bottom of the page stopped Penelope's breath. "Please do not mention the Colorado matter to Penny. Father's debt is my burden, not hers. I will settle it after we are married." Penelope read the line 3 times. Colorado, debt. Her father-in-law, a man she had barely known before he died, had debts in Colorado that Thomas had known about and kept from her. And Mrs. Henderson had known too. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was sharp, sharper than it had been in months. For the first time since Thomas died, the fog inside her head was clearing, replaced by something focused and intent. She was no longer numb. She was hunting. That evening, while sweeping the back room before closing, she found something else on the floor near where Austin had stood earlier that day. A scrap of paper, torn hastily from a larger piece bearing just 2 handwritten words in ink that was not Thomas's and not Mrs. Henderson's. He knows. Penelope held the scrap in her palm and looked at it. He knows. 2 words that could mean anything or nothing. They had fallen from Austin's coat pocket when he pulled out his supply list. She had seen him fumble slightly with the paper, unusual for a man whose movements were usually so deliberate. She put the scrap in her apron pocket beside Thomas's letter. 2 pieces of a puzzle she did not yet understand. But she was starting to see the edges. She wore the gloves the next day. She told herself it was practical. Her hands were cold. The wool was good quality. It meant nothing. But when Austin came in 3 days later and his eyes dropped to her hands and then back to her face without comment, without triumph, without any sign of satisfaction except the slightest softening at the corners of his mouth, Penelope felt the crack inside her widen just a fraction more. "Thank you," she said. The words felt rusty, foreign, like a door being opened for the first time in years. "They are very warm." "Good," Austin said. "That is what they are for." Mrs. Henderson, who had returned to work after her cough improved, watched this exchange from near the back counter. She said nothing, but her eyes moved between Penelope and Austin with an expression that was equal parts hope and worry. And when Penelope glanced at her later, the old woman said something quiet that did not seem connected to anything. "Be careful with your heart, child, but also be careful with the truth." Penelope had not understood the first part. Now, with Thomas's letter in her pocket, she understood the second. That night, riding back to the ranch, Austin noticed something on the trail that made him pull his horse to a stop. Hoofprints in the mud, fresh, from 2 horses shod in the city style. Not ranch stock. City horses, the kind that carried men who wore suits and polished shoes and had business that rarely involved cattle. Someone from far away had come to Petaluma. And in Austin's experience, city people riding into small towns rarely brought good news. Garrett Holloway stepped down from the stagecoach in Petaluma wearing a 3-piece suit, shoes polished bright enough to reflect the California sun, and the smile of a man who had never heard the word no without finding a way to turn it into yes. He was 45 years old, tall, well-built, with silver-threaded dark hair, and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite that lined the Colorado mountains where he had made his fortune. His hands were clean, his nails were trimmed. He carried himself with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, whether through charm or through force, depending on what the situation required. The town of Petaluma greeted him the way small towns greeted wealthy strangers, with curiosity and cautious welcome. He checked into the hotel, the nicest room available, and within 2 hours had introduced himself to every business owner on the main street as a Denver investor interested in buying dairy land in Sonoma County. He spoke well. He listened better. He bought Sheriff Cal Briggs 3 fingers of good whiskey at the saloon and asked intelligent questions about the local cattle market. He brought Mrs. Henderson a box of imported chocolates and complimented her store with the practiced warmth of a man who understood that small kindnesses opened doors faster than skeleton keys. The town liked him, of course it did. Garrett Holloway had spent his entire adult life learning how to be liked by people he intended to use. That first night, alone in his hotel room, Holloway unpacked his things with methodical precision. At the bottom of his trunk, beneath folded shirts and a spare pair of boots, he found what he always found: an old photograph, tintype, showing a man with hard eyes and a thick leather belt coiled in his right hand. The man's mouth was set in a line that suggested he had never smiled or had forgotten how. Holloway looked at the photograph for a long time. His father, dead now for 3 years, though not from natural causes, and not by the hand the law believed had killed him. He placed the photograph face down in the dresser drawer. He did not burn it, did not throw it away. He kept it the way some people kept the thing that had broken them, as a reminder that the world was built on cruelty, and the only question was whether you were the one holding the belt or the one it hit. Penelope met Garrett Holloway for the first time the next morning when he came into the general store to buy supplies. He was polite, perfectly mannered. He called her ma'am and asked her opinion on the best local cheese and which road to take out to the Morrison Ranch, where he said he had heard good things about the cattle operation. But Penelope was hunting now, and hunters notice things that ordinary people miss. She noticed that when Holloway leaned against the counter and his eyes drifted across the open ledger where Mrs. Henderson kept her accounts, his gaze paused for just a fraction of a second on one particular page. The page with the name Edwards written at the top, an old credit account that Henderson had never closed. He asked too casually whether the store had been in business long, whether it served many of the local ranching families, whether there were any other businesses for sale in the area. Penelope answered his questions with her usual flat professionalism, but she filed every one of them away in the part of her mind that was no longer numb, the part that was pulling threads and following them wherever they led. After Holloway left, she stood behind the counter and thought about Thomas's letter. Colorado. A debt. A man named Holloway was now standing in her store asking questions about the Edwards name. It could be a coincidence. Penelope did not believe in coincidences. That same afternoon, on the road between the Morrison Ranch and town, Austin Jennings saw Garrett Holloway for the first time in nearly 3 years. And his body reacted before his mind caught up. He went rigid in the saddle. His right hand dropped to his hip where a pistol should have been but was not, because he had sold his gun in Reno to pay for feed for his horse. His vision tunneled, his pulse hammered in his ears. Every instinct he had, honed in 2 years of running, screamed at him to turn around and ride and keep riding until there was 1,000 miles between himself and that face. Hank Morrison, riding beside him, noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Austin forced his hand away from his empty hip. "Nothing. Thought I recognized someone. Mistook them for somebody else." Morrison looked at him with the steady, evaluating eyes of a man who had spent 4 years in a war and knew when another man was lying. He said nothing. But from that day forward, Austin stopped riding into town. He sent one of the other hands for supplies. He stayed close to the ranch, mending fences, working cattle, keeping his head down and his face out of sight. Penelope noticed his absence. She did not want to notice. She told herself for the first week that it did not matter. Customers came and went. He was nobody special, just another cowboy buying supplies and candy. The second week, she snapped at a customer who took too long choosing between 2 kinds of coffee beans. And when the woman left in a huff, Penelope stood behind the counter and realized her hands were shaking. Not from anger, from something she did not want to name. The third week, she asked Mrs. Henderson as casually as she could manage, "Has anyone from the Morrison Ranch been in this week?" Henderson shook her head. "Not yet, but I expect they will send someone soon. They are running low on coffee if they are keeping to their usual schedule." The following day, Rosa Delgado walked into the store carrying Austin's supply list. She was dressed for riding, dust on her boots, her dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed hat. She handed the list to Penelope with a nod and began browsing the fabric bolts near the window. Penelope looked at the list, Austin's handwriting. She recognized it now, could pick it out from a dozen others. That realization bothered her more than the fact of his absence. "Austin busy?" she asked, aiming for casual and missing by a country mile. Rosa turned and studied her with those sharp, measuring eyes. She seemed to be weighing something, deciding how much to say. Then she spoke in a voice that was quiet, but direct. "He is hiding. Not from you. From something a lot worse." Penelope held Rosa's gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and began filling the order without another word. But inside, the hunting part of her mind was working faster now. Austin was hiding. Holloway had arrived. Thomas's letter mentioned Colorado. Austin was from Colorado. The threads were converging, and Penelope meant to follow them to wherever they led. That night, after dark, Austin sat in the Morrison Ranch horse barn with his back against a stall door and his head in his hands. He had been like this for an hour, turning the situation over and over in his mind, trying to see a way through that did not end with him in irons or in the ground. He heard boots on the barn floor and looked up to find Hank Morrison standing over him, holding a lantern in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. The rancher's face was unreadable in the lamplight. "We need to talk," Morrison said. He sat down on a hay bale across from Austin and set the lantern between them. The shadows it cast turned the barn into a cathedral of light and dark. Austin said nothing. He waited. "I know who you are," Morrison said. "I served in the same regiment as your father during the war, 18th Kansas Infantry. Your father was James Jennings, Sergeant, Company B. Good man, brave soldier. You look just like him." Austin felt something inside him collapse. The careful structure of lies and half-truths he had built over 2 years crumbled in an instant. His shoulders dropped. His hands fell to his sides. He stared at Morrison and could not speak. But Morrison was not finished. "I also know who Garrett Holloway is. His father, Emmett Holloway, ran guns for the Confederacy through Kansas before the war ended. After the war, he went into ranching and land speculation in Colorado. Made a fortune doing business the kind of way that makes a fortune and enemies in equal measure. Garrett is the same breed. Maybe worse." Morrison paused. "Whatever Holloway says you did, I do not believe it." Austin found his voice. It was rough, scraped thin by years of silence. He said it all. The scarlet fever that killed his parents and brothers. Emmett Holloway dying under suspicious circumstances. Garrett accusing Austin of the murder. The warrant. The judge in Garrett's pocket. The $200 bounty. The flight west through Nevada and into California. Changing names, changing towns, never stopping long enough to build anything worth losing. Morrison listened without interrupting. When Austin was done, the rancher poured whiskey into 2 tin cups and handed one across. "You have 2 choices," Morrison said. "You can ride out tonight. Head north to Oregon, south to Mexico, anywhere Holloway has not reached yet. Or you can stay and fight." Austin looked at the whiskey in his cup. Stay and fight. 3 words that sounded simple and were anything but. "If you stay," Morrison continued, "you tell the truth. To me, to the sheriff, and to the girl at the general store you buy peppermint sticks for every week." Austin looked up sharply. Morrison's expression did not change. "I pay attention. It is a habit from the war that I never broke." He poured more whiskey. Then he said the thing that nearly made Austin drop his cup. "There is one more thing. Holloway did not come here for land. He's been asking Sheriff Briggs questions about the Thomas Edwards case." Austin went still. "Thomas Edwards? The young man who was killed on his wedding night last April, shot through a hotel window. Sheriff ruled it a stray bullet from a saloon fight. His widow works at Henderson's store." Penelope's face flashed in Austin's mind. The dead eyes, the ice, the way she held herself like a woman who had already survived the worst thing that could happen and was just waiting for the next blow. Penelope Edwards. That was her name. Edwards. He thought about Thomas's letter in Penelope's apron pocket, the one he did not know about yet. He thought about the word Colorado appearing in both their stories, like a thread connecting 2 lives that should never have crossed. Something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the November night. "I will stay," he said. "I will tell the truth. All of it." Morrison nodded. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." But Austin did not sleep. He sat in the barn long after Morrison left, watching the lantern burn down, thinking about wanted circulars and widow women, and the particular way that trouble had of finding the people who least deserved it. Around midnight, he left the barn and walked to the edge of the ranch property where the road led south toward town. He stood in the darkness and looked toward Petaluma, invisible in the fog except for a few faint points of lamplight. Penelope was locking the store for the night. He could not see her, but he knew her routine by now, the careful way she checked the door, tested the lock, wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders before walking the 2 blocks to her room. He stood across the street in the shadow of the livery stable and watched her. He did not cross over, did not speak, just stood there in the dark, wanting to warn her, wanting to tell her everything, and knowing that the truth he carried might be the one thing that would make her close those already closed eyes for good. When she glanced across the street, she could not have seen more than a shape in the shadows. But she paused, stood very still, and in the lamplight bleeding through the store window, if she had been close enough, she would have seen on his face the thing she knew better than anyone alive, the fear of losing everything you had left. Penelope did not believe in coincidences. The last time she had believed in one, her husband was standing by a window, and the time after that he was lying on the floor. Thomas's letter sat in her apron pocket like a coal that would not cool. Colorado. A debt. Henderson knew. Austin was from Colorado. Holloway was from Colorado. And now Austin had stopped coming to town at the exact same time Holloway had arrived. Penelope was not a woman who waited for answers to come to her. She had spent 5 months waiting, frozen, numb, letting the world happen around her like weather. That was over now. The letter had changed something. The hunting instinct that had lain dormant beneath all that ice was awake, and it was hungry. On Sunday afternoon, she borrowed Mrs. Henderson's mule and rode north to the Morrison Ranch. The ride took 40 minutes through hills that were turning green with the first winter rains. The fog had lifted for once, and the Sonoma landscape spread out around her in rolling waves of grassland broken by clusters of oak trees and the occasional weathered barn. Cattle dotted the hillsides. Hawks circled overhead. The air smelled of wet earth and grass, and the faint salt tang carried inland from the coast. Morrison Ranch sat in a shallow valley with a creek running through it. The main house was a solid 2-story structure of unpainted timber, and the outbuildings, bunkhouse, barn, breaking pen, cookhouse spread around it in the organized chaos of a working cattle operation. Smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney. The sound of horses and men's voices carried across the yard. Rosa Delgado was the first person to see Penelope ride in. She stood up from the bench outside the cookhouse where she had been mending a shirt, looked at Penelope with no surprise whatsoever, and walked over to take the mule's reins. "He is behind the horse barn," Rosa said. She placed a tin cup of coffee in Penelope's free hand without asking. In Spanish, she added, "He has been fighting with himself all week. Maybe you can settle the matter." Penelope took the coffee and walked around the main barn to the smaller structure behind it where Morrison kept the horse tack and medical supplies. Austin was there, sitting on an overturned bucket, cleaning a bridle with the mechanical focus of a man trying to keep his hands busy so his mind would not eat him alive. He looked up when he heard her boots. His face showed surprise, then something that might have been relief, then a careful blankness that Penelope recognized because she wore it herself. She did not waste time on pleasantries. She pulled Thomas's letter from her pocket and held it up. "What is your connection to Colorado?" she said. "To a man named Holloway. And what does any of it have to do with my dead husband?" Austin set down the bridle. He looked at the letter in her hand, at her face, at the letter again. She could see him making a decision, watching the walls behind his eyes rearrange themselves, opening doors that had been locked for 2 years. He told her, all of it, the scarlet fever, his family, Emmett Holloway's death, Garrett's accusation, the warrant, the rigged court, the running. When he finished, Penelope was quiet for a long time. Then she told him about the letter, about Thomas's father owing a debt to someone in Colorado, about Mrs. Henderson knowing and hiding it. Austin's face changed. "Your husband's father owed money to a Holloway?" The pieces were fitting together for both of them simultaneously, like 2 halves of a broken plate being held up to the light. Different patterns, same fracture line. But Penelope did not soften. The anger that had been building since she found the letter, since she realized that everyone around her had been keeping secrets, since she understood that her husband's death might be connected to a web of violence and greed that stretched all the way to Colorado, That anger found its target. "You brought this here," she said, and her voice was cold in a way that had nothing to do with ice and everything to do with fire. "Whatever is following you, you led it to the one place I had left. The one town where nobody knew me and nobody wanted anything from me. And now there is a man from Colorado staying in the hotel and asking questions about my dead husband, and you are hiding on a ranch pretending none of it is connected. It was unfair." Part of her knew it was unfair even as the words left her mouth. Austin had not known about Thomas, had not known about the debt, had not chosen Petaluma because of her. But fear makes people cruel, and Penelope was more afraid than she had been since the night she held the colt to her head. Because this fear was different. This fear was not about losing something she already had. It was about losing something she had not yet admitted she wanted. Austin did not defend himself. He sat on the bucket and looked at her with those creekwater eyes and said, "You are right to be angry. And you have every right to tell me to go. I will ride out tonight if you want." Penelope said nothing. She turned and walked back to the mule and rode away without looking back. The tears came on the road home. The second time she had cried since Thomas died. Not because Austin had lied to her, though he had by omission. Not because she was scared, though she was. She cried because she realized that if Austin Jennings rode out of Petaluma tonight, something inside her would break that she had not known was still intact. She had sworn she would never give anyone that power again. And here she was, crying on a borrowed mule because a cowboy with sad eyes and a sweet tooth had gotten under her skin. On the ride back, she passed the hotel where Holloway was staying. He was standing on the veranda with Sheriff Briggs, both men holding glasses of whiskey, talking like old friends. When Holloway saw Penelope, he tipped his hat, a perfect gentleman's gesture, smooth and practiced. But his eyes tracked her all the way down the street. And they were not the eyes of a gentleman. They were the eyes of a man counting his assets. Penelope rode the rest of the way home with her jaw clenched and her mind working. She had two threads now, Austin's story and Thomas's letter. They both pointed to the same name. She was no longer a grieving widow staring at the ceiling. She was a woman with a purpose. Back at the ranch, Austin sat alone on the bucket for a long time after Penelope left. Rosa came by eventually with a plate of beans and rice that he did not touch. "She will come back," Rosa said, leaning against the barn door with her arms crossed. "How do you know?" Because she was angry. People do not get angry at people they do not care about. Austin looked at the 3 peppermint sticks on the shelf above his cot, the ones he had bought this week and had not eaten. 3 sticks, one for each brother he had lost, a ritual he performed at every town, a small private ceremony of grief that no one had ever asked about, and he had never explained. He thought about his brothers, he thought about Penelope. He thought about how the 2 kinds of love, the one you lose and the one you might find, felt almost exactly the same in the chest, both terrifying, both impossible to turn away from. That night, Mrs. Henderson knocked on Penelope's door. It was the first time in 2 years the old woman had come to her room. Penelope opened the door and found Henderson standing there in her nightgown, a shawl around her shoulders, her face drawn with something that was equal parts love and guilt. "There is something I need to tell you about Thomas," Henderson said. "I should have told you a long time ago." Mrs. Henderson made it halfway through her confession before her face went gray, her left hand seized the front of her dress, and she slid sideways off the bed where she had been sitting. Penelope caught her, dropped to the floor and cradled the old woman's head in her lap and felt the world lurch beneath her, because this was the universe telling her once more that anything she cared about would be ripped away. Henderson's face was the color of ash. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her left arm hung limp. "Help!" Penelope shouted. "Somebody help me!" It was Rosa's husband, Miguel Delgado, who heard her. He had been walking back to the Morrison Ranch from a late errand in town and was passing the seamstress shop when Penelope's voice cut through the quiet street. He came up the stairs 2 at a time, took one look at Henderson, and carried the old woman down to the street with the gentleness of a man used to handling newborn calves. The doctor was a half-mile away. Miguel drove the wagon while Penelope held Henderson's hand and whispered words she did not know she had in her. "Hold on. Please, hold on. I need you. Do not leave me too." The doctor, an old German named Hoffman, who had been practicing medicine in Petaluma since before the war, examined Henderson and delivered his verdict with the bluntness of his profession. "Her heart," he said. She had survived this episode, but she would need weeks of rest, maybe months. No work, no stress, no excitement. Henderson lay in the doctor's spare room, propped up on pillows, her face still gray but her eyes open. She looked at Penelope with the desperate urgency of a woman who had been interrupted mid-sentence on the most important thing she had ever tried to say. "My desk," Henderson whispered. Her voice was barely audible. "Bottom drawer. Everything is there. I'm sorry, child." Then her eyes closed and she slept. Penelope sat beside her until dawn, holding her hand, listening to the old woman breathe, counting each breath the way she had once counted inventory, making sure the numbers kept going up. When morning came, Penelope walked to the store alone. She unlocked the door and stood in the empty building and felt the silence press against her like something solid. Henderson's absence was physical. The store felt wrong without her, like a body without a heartbeat. The desk was in the back room, an old roll-top with brass handles and a lock that Henderson kept the key to on a chain around her neck. Penelope did not have the key. She used a pry bar from the tool shelf and broke the lock open with a single hard wrench. The wood splintered. The drawer slid out. Inside, she found 3 letters, a bank transfer receipt, and a bullet. The letters were from a man named Albert Worth, private investigator, San Francisco. They were addressed to Mrs. Ida Henderson and dated over the past 18 months. Penelope laid them out on the counter in chronological order and read them one by one, her hands trembling but her mind as sharp as a blade. The first letter was cautious. Mr. Worth had been hired by Henderson to investigate the circumstances of Thomas Edwards's death. Initial findings were inconclusive, but he had discovered that Thomas's father, James Edwards, had owed a significant sum of money to a land speculator in Colorado named Garrett Holloway. The debt was secured against a parcel of land in Sonoma County that James Edwards had purchased years earlier and that Thomas had inherited. The second letter was more specific. Worth had traced the debt through banking records in Trinidad, Colorado. The amount was substantial. Holloway had been pressuring James Edwards for years to sell the Sonoma land to satisfy the debt. James had refused. Then James died. The debt passed to Thomas. The third letter was the one that changed everything. Worth had obtained testimony from a retired deputy in Trinidad who claimed that on the night Thomas Edwards was killed in Petaluma, a man matching the description of Holloway's known associate, a hired gun named Kurt Dawson, had been seen in the Petaluma area. The bullet recovered from the scene was a .44-40 Winchester cartridge, an expensive round not typically used in saloon pistols. Worth's conclusion? Thomas Edwards was not killed by a stray bullet from a bar fight. He was assassinated by a professional shooter hired by Garrett Holloway to eliminate the heir to the Sonoma land and create pressure on the surviving widow to sell. Penelope sat behind the counter holding the bullet. A .44-40 Winchester. She rolled it between her fingers. It was heavier than she expected, or maybe that was just the weight of what it represented. Thomas had not died by accident. Not wrong place, wrong time. Not bad luck. Someone had paid money to put a bullet through his chest on their wedding night so that a rich man in Colorado could take a piece of dirt in Sonoma County. The cold that settled over Penelope now was different from the ice she had lived inside for 5 months. That ice had been defensive, protective, a way of shutting out pain. This cold was offensive. This cold was the focused fury of a woman who had just learned that her husband was murdered for profit, and that the murderer was currently sipping whiskey on the hotel veranda, a quarter-mile from where she sat. She looked at the nightstand drawer where Thomas's Colt waited. For the first time, she did not think of it as a last exit. She thought of it as a weapon. She rode to the Morrison Ranch for the second time that week. But this was not the same woman who had ridden there before, angry and hurt and confused. This was someone else entirely, someone harder, someone with a target. She found Austin in the same place behind the horse barn, but this time she did not accuse him. She walked straight to him and asked one question. "Tell me the name of the man who framed you." Austin looked at her. He saw the change immediately. The dead eyes were gone. In their place was something that burned so hot it was almost cold. He had seen that look before, in the faces of men about to go into battle, in the faces of people who had been pushed past their limit and come out the other side with nothing left to lose. "Garrett Holloway," he said. Penelope did not flinch. She just nodded. And Austin understood that whatever Mrs. Henderson had started to tell her, Penelope had finished finding out on her own. "He killed my husband," she said. Her voice was flat, but her hands, the hands wearing the gray wool gloves he had given her, were clenched so tight the knuckle bones showed white through the fabric. They moved inside to Morrison's kitchen, 3 of them around the table. Penelope, Austin, Morrison. Henderson's letters spread out between them. Thomas's letter from the back room, the bullet sitting in the center of the table like an accusation. Morrison spoke first. "We need evidence that will hold up. Henderson's investigator has built a case, but it is circumstantial. We need Holloway to show his hand." Austin said, "He has 2 men with him. I have seen them. Kurt Dawson and another one they call Mackey. Dawson is the dangerous one, former soldier. Does not miss." Penelope looked at the bullet on the table. "Dawson. Is he the one who would have pulled the trigger on Thomas?" Austin met her eyes. "Yes, that would be his kind of work." The room was quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon sun was sinking behind the western hills, and the first stars were appearing in a sky the color of a bruise. "What do we do?" Penelope asked. "We get Holloway to expose himself," Morrison said. "Make him think the land is available. Let him come to us. And when he shows what he is, we make sure the sheriff sees it." Penelope nodded. "I can do that. He has already been asking me about the land. I will let him think I am a stupid widow who does not know what she owns." Austin started to speak, stopped, then spoke anyway. "That is dangerous. If he suspects you know what he did." "I know what he did." Penelope's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife. "He killed my husband. He stole 2 years of my life, and would have stolen more if Mrs. Henderson had not been braver than I deserved. I am not going to sit in that store and wait for someone else to fix this." When she rode back toward town that evening, she was aware that Austin was following her. She could hear the hooves of his horse at a distance matching her pace. At first it annoyed her. Then she understood. There was a killer in Petaluma, and she was riding alone in the dark. She stopped her mule and spoke into the shadows behind her. "I know you are there." Austin rode into the moonlight. He did not apologize. "There is a killer in this town. You should not ride alone." Penelope looked at him. The moonlight caught the angles of his face and turned his eyes to silver. She thought about all the time she had pushed people away, all the time she had turned cold and distant because distance was safe and connection was death. She thought about Thomas standing by a window and a bullet that came through the glass. And for the first time, instead of pushing Austin away, she waited for him to ride beside her. They rode the rest of the way to town in silence, side by side, and the silence between them was different now. Not the silence of strangers, the silence of allies. Penelope smiled at Garrett Holloway, and the smile made Austin, standing outside the store window where he could see but not be seen, go cold down his spine. Not from jealousy, from something deeper and more unsettling. He had never seen Penelope act before, and she was terrifyingly good at it. The plan was simple in concept and dangerous in execution. Penelope would approach Holloway as the naive widow who knew nothing about the land, nothing about the debt, nothing about the way her husband had really died. She would let him think he was dealing with a simple-minded woman who could be manipulated into signing away her inheritance for a fraction of its value. And while his attention was on Penelope, Morrison and Austin would work to gather the evidence they needed to prove what Holloway had done. Morrison had learned through the telegraph operator in town, a man who owed him a favor, that Holloway had sent a wire to Trinidad 3 days earlier requesting additional men. They had perhaps 5 days before reinforcements arrived. The clock was ticking. Penelope began her performance on a Tuesday morning. She changed into a better dress, one she had not worn since before Thomas died. She pinned her hair differently, softer, let a few strands fall around her face. She smiled at customers. She made conversation. To anyone watching, it looked like the cold widow Edwards was finally coming back to life. Holloway noticed within a day. He was a man who paid attention to weakness the way a wolf pays attention to a limp, and a woman emerging from grief was a woman who might be susceptible to charm. He came into the store on Wednesday with his hat in his hand and his best smile on his face. He asked about the weather, about the cheese, about whether Penelope had considered what she might do with herself now that she was. He paused delicately, moving forward with her life. Penelope played her part with the skill of someone who had spent 5 months pretending to feel nothing. Pretending to feel something was just the same skill pointed in the opposite direction. Thomas mentioned some land once, she said, her voice light and uncertain, something his father left him. But I never paid attention to those things. What would a woman know about property deeds? Holloway leaned forward slightly. His eyes sharpened with the particular brightness of a predator that has just spotted unguarded prey. Land in Sonoma County, you say? Well now, that could be quite valuable depending on the location. Would you like me to look into it for you? I have some experience with land transactions, and I would be happy to help a lady in your position. Penelope let her eyes widen just a fraction. Oh, I would not want to impose. You have your own business to tend to. It would be no imposition at all. Consider it a neighborly service. Outside the window, Austin watched this exchange and felt 2 things at once. Admiration for the way Penelope controlled the conversation, feeding Holloway exactly what he wanted to hear while giving away nothing real. And fear, deep and cold, for what would happen if Holloway figured out he was being played. Meanwhile, Austin had his own problems. Holloway's men, Kurt Dawson and the one called Mackey, had been spending their evenings at the saloon drinking and talking. Mackey was the talker. After a few whiskeys, he became loose with his words, asking the bartender and anyone who would listen whether there were any new cowboys in town, anyone from out of state, anyone from Colorado in particular. Austin heard about this from one of Morrison's vaqueros who drank at the same saloon. Holloway knew or suspected that Austin was in the area. The question was how long before Dawson came looking. He did not have to wait long. 3 days after Penelope began her performance with Holloway, Austin was mending fence on the north boundary of Morrison's property when he heard hooves approaching. He straightened up from the fence post and saw a rider coming along the ridge line, moving at an easy pace that was too deliberate to be casual. Kurt Dawson. Austin recognized him from Trinidad. A lean man with a narrow face and pale eyes that looked like they had been bleached by too much sun or too little conscience. Dawson was a killer by trade, the kind who did his work quietly and moved on without fuss. He wore a pistol low on his right hip and rode with the loose seat of a man who was comfortable on horseback and comfortable with violence. Their eyes met across 50 yards of open grassland. Austin saw the recognition register on Dawson's face, saw his hand drift toward the gun on his hip, and dropped behind the fence post as the first shot cracked the morning air and sent splinters flying from the wood where his head had been. What followed was a chase. Austin grabbed the nearest horse, a Morrison ranch mount tied to a post nearby, and swung into the saddle at a dead run. Dawson followed, firing twice more, both shots going wide as the horses plunged through chest-high grass and around clusters of oak trees. Austin knew the terrain better than Dawson. Morrison had put him to work on this section for weeks. He led the chase downhill toward the creek bottom where the vaqueros were moving cattle. And when he burst through the tree line into the open meadow with 3 mounted vaqueros staring at him in surprise, Dawson pulled up short. He would not shoot in front of witnesses. He wheeled his horse and rode back the way he had come. Austin sat on the borrowed horse, breathing hard, his heart slamming in his chest. The vaqueros looked at him. One of them, An older man named Julio said something in Spanish that Rosa would have translated as, "You are going to tell us what that was about, yes?" Austin reported to Morrison within the hour. Morrison listened, poured whiskey, and said 4 words that settled the matter. "We are out of time." That night, with the ranch dark and quiet around them, Penelope came to the Morrison property for the 3rd time. Rosa had sent word through Miguel. Penelope had ridden out after dark, taking back roads, watching behind her. She found Austin in the horse barn, not cleaning tack this time, just sitting in the dark with his back against a stall door, looking at nothing. She sat down beside him, not touching, an arm's length of space between them. The barn smelled of hay and horse and leather, and the only light was moonlight coming through the gaps in the wall boards, painting silver stripes across the dirt floor. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Penelope said something she had never told another living soul. 3 days after the funeral, I loaded Thomas's colt and pressed it against my temple. I had it all planned. Figured I would do it at night so nobody would find me until morning, and the mess would not be too bad for whoever had to clean it up. Austin did not move, did not interrupt, just listened. "The only reason I did not pull the trigger," Penelope continued, "was that my hand cramped, not courage, not God, not some moment of clarity, a muscle spasm. That is what saved my life, a cramp in my thumb. The silence that followed was the kind that exists in churches and at gravesides." Then Austin spoke. "I had a night like that, too. On the bank of the Arkansas River, about 6 months after the fever took my family. I had my father's pistol, had it loaded and ready. I was going to wade into the river and do it there so the water would carry me off and nobody would have to deal with the body." "What stopped you?" I heard my brother laugh. My youngest brother, Danny. He had this laugh that was too big for him, this great booming laugh that came out of this skinny little 12-year-old body and made everyone in the room smile. I heard it clear as day coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around, but there was nobody there, just the river and the dark. But I heard it, and I could not pull the trigger after that. They sat in the dark together. They did not kiss, did not hold hands, did not touch at all. They just sat side by side in the darkness. 2 people who had been to the edge and come back, sharing the deepest scars either of them had ever shown to another person. And it was the most intimate moment either of them had ever had with anyone. After a long time, Penelope said, "If this does not end well, if Holloway wins, promise me something, anything. Stop running, stay here, live, for both of us." Austin turned his head and looked at her in the dark. The moonlight caught the edge of her face, the line of her jaw, the gleam of her eyes. "I promise," he said. Penelope stood up. She had to go. Dawn was coming. But before she left, she said one more thing. "I am going to push Holloway harder tomorrow. Get him to put something on paper about the land." Austin's expression changed. "That is too fast. He is smarter than he looks. If you push him before we are ready, he could." "I know what I am doing," Penelope said. And there was a note in her voice, a sharpness that Austin recognized as the sound of a person who has been powerless for too long and has finally found something they can control. He wanted to argue, but he also remembered her holding the shotgun with steady hands, and he knew that Penelope Edwards was not a woman who responded well to being told what she could and could not do. "Be careful," he said instead. She nodded. Then she was gone. The next morning, when Penelope unlocked the store, she went straight to the lockbox where she had placed Henderson's documents for safekeeping. She turned the key, opened the lid. The box was empty. The letters, the bank receipt, the bullet, all of it, gone. Someone had been in the store during the night, and they had taken the only proof that Penelope Edwards owned anything at all. Garrett Holloway was not a stupid man. He had survived the Civil War, 3 bloody land disputes in Colorado, and 1 near hanging by saying the right words to the right people at the right time. He had built a fortune on the backs of dead men's debts and called it business. He had learned from his father that the world belonged to those willing to take it, And he had learned from his father's belt that mercy was a weakness only the strong could afford. And since nobody was strong, nobody could afford it. But he made the biggest mistake of his life when he underestimated a 25-year-old widow in a dairy town. Penelope did not wait. The stolen documents changed the timeline. If Holloway had the papers, he knew she had been investigating. The pretense of the naive widow was over. She could either retreat or attack, and Penelope was done retreating. She confronted Holloway at the store that afternoon. He came in for his usual visit, wearing his usual smile, and Penelope dropped the act like a coach she no longer needed. "I know about the land," she said, standing behind the counter with her hands flat on the wood. "I know about the debt. And I know that Thomas did not die from a stray bullet." Holloway's smile did not change, but his eyes did. The warmth went out of them like a lamp being extinguished, and what was left underneath was something cold and flat and very old, the eyes of a man who had learned cruelty before he learned to walk. "That is an interesting theory, Mrs. Edwards." "It is not a theory. It is a fact. And you are going to answer for it." Holloway straightened his cuffs. His voice remained pleasant, conversational, the way a doctor's voice remains calm while delivering a terminal diagnosis. "Mrs. Edwards, you are a young woman who has suffered a terrible loss. Grief does strange things to the mind. I would hate to see you make accusations that could damage your reputation in this community." Penelope did not blink. "My reputation? You are worried about my reputation. I am worried about your future. A widow alone in a town like this, without friends, without resources. Life can become very difficult for someone in your position." It was a threat dressed in concern, and they both knew it. Penelope felt the anger rising in her chest, hot and bright, and she should have stopped, should have held the line, should have waited for Morrison and Austin and the evidence they were still trying to build. But 5 months of frozen numbness and 2 weeks of burning fury had come together in a combination that was not rational, and the words came out before she could stop them. "I know about Garrett Holloway," she said. "I know about the Jennings family. I know about Kurt Dawson, and I know that you came to Petaluma to finish what you started in Colorado." The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, a dog barked. A wagon creaked past on the street. Inside the store, the space between Penelope and Holloway became something solid and dangerous. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. Then the smile returned. But it was a different smile now. The smile of a man who has just realized that the game has changed and is already calculating his next move. "I see," he said quietly. "You have been busy, Mrs. Edwards." He turned and walked out of the store. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded to Penelope like the cocking of a hammer. She stood behind the counter and felt the adrenaline drain from her body, replaced by the cold realization of what she had just done. She had tipped her hand, shown Holloway that she knew everything, given him time to prepare, to plan, to move against her before she was ready. She had made a mistake. The consequences came fast. Within 2 hours, Holloway was in Sheriff Briggs's office presenting a wanted circular he had carried from Colorado. The name on the paper was Austin Jennings. The charge was murder in the first degree. The bounty was $200. Briggs was a lazy man, but he was still a lawman. A wanted circular from a legitimate jurisdiction was not something he could ignore, no matter how much whiskey the man presenting it had bought him. He strapped on his gun, saddled his horse, and rode to Morrison Ranch. Austin knew the sheriff was coming before he arrived. One of the vaqueros had spotted Briggs on the road and ridden ahead to warn Morrison. The two men stood in the ranch yard, Morrison with his arms crossed and Austin beside him, and watched the dust cloud of the approaching rider. "I can hide you," Morrison said. "There are canyons in the hills where a man could stay for weeks without being found." Austin shook his head. He thought about Penelope alone in town with Holloway and his men. He thought about the promise he had made in the dark barn, the promise to stop running. "No," he said. "No more running." When Briggs arrived, Austin was standing in the yard with his hands at his sides and his face calm. The arrest was not violent. Austin extended his wrists for the cuffs. Rosa stood on the cookhouse steps and wept. The vaqueros gathered in a silent, angry cluster. Morrison looked at Briggs and said words that the sheriff would not forget. "You are arresting the wrong man, Cal, and somewhere down in that whiskey-soaked gut of yours you know it." Briggs said nothing. He put Austin on a horse and rode with him back to town. Penelope was behind the counter when she saw them through the store window. Austin on horseback, wrists bound, riding beside the sheriff. She watched them pass and something inside her broke open. She dropped the jar of peppermint sticks she had been holding. It shattered on the floor and candy scattered in every direction, rolling under shelves and into corners. She stared at the peppermint sticks on the floor and thought, "He buys 3 every week." 3. She did not know why yet, but seeing them scattered and broken felt like watching something precious shatter. She went to the jail. It was a small stone building beside the sheriff's office, 2 cells, a desk, a wood stove. Austin sat on the cell bunk with his elbows on his knees and looked at her through the iron bars with a calm that made her want to scream. "This is my fault," she said. "I pushed too fast. I should have waited. You did what you thought was right. That is not a fault. That is who you are." "I told Holloway I knew everything. I lost my temper and gave away our advantage, and now you are in a cell because of me." Austin stood and walked to the bars. His face was composed, but something shifted behind it when Penelope mentioned confronting Holloway alone. "You went to him alone," he said. His voice changed. The patient, quiet tone she had come to know was gone, replaced by something raw and ragged. "Do you understand what he does to people who threaten him?" "He does not argue, Penelope. He kills. He burned my family's land to the ground. He framed me for a murder he committed. And you walked up to him and told him you knew." The words hit her like slaps. She stepped back from the bars and her face closed like a door slamming shut. The ice returned, fast and familiar, because this was the thing she knew how to do. Shut down, close off, become unreachable. Austin saw it happen, and the anger drained out of him like water from a punctured bucket. He pressed his forehead against the bars and closed his eyes. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "I am sorry. I am not angry at you. I am terrified of losing you, and I do not know how to be terrified without it coming out as rage. That is my damage, not yours." The silence stretched between them. Then Penelope stepped forward and pressed her fingers through the bars. Austin's hands found hers and held on. It was not romantic. It was 2 drowning people gripping the same piece of wood. "I know what damage looks like," Penelope said quietly. "I own plenty of it. Do not apologize for being human. Just do not make it a habit." Austin tried to smile. Failed. Tried again. "That is fair." Holloway came to the store an hour later. He had dropped the pretense entirely now. No charm. No courtesy. Just the flat calculation of a man who held all the cards and knew it. "Mrs. Edwards, I admire your courage, but courage does not pay taxes. You are a widow, alone, without resources. The man you seem to have attached yourself to is sitting in a cell charged with murder. Your employer is bedridden, and I have the means to make your life in this town very uncomfortable." Penelope stood behind the counter and looked at him with eyes that had gone cold again, but in a new way. Not the numbness of grief, the controlled fury of a woman who has been pushed to her limit and found something on the other side that she did not know existed. "You know what is interesting about widows, Mr. Holloway? We have already lost the most valuable thing we had. There is nothing left for you to threaten us with." Holloway paused at the door on his way out, turned back, and said the thing that changed the equation entirely. "Did you know that the man you are protecting, Austin Jennings, murdered my father?" The words hung in the air. Penelope stared at him. Holloway held her gaze with the absolute confidence of a man who has practiced this lie so many times he half believes it himself. Then he was gone. And Penelope understood with complete clarity that Holloway did not just want the land. He wanted Austin dead. That night, the Petaluma jailhouse burned. Penelope smelled the smoke before she saw the flames. She was in her room above the seamstress shop, unable to sleep, when the acrid stink of kerosene drifted through her open window. She was on her feet and running before the first shout went up from the street. The back wall of the jail was already engulfed when she arrived. Flames licked up the stone and timber structure, feeding on the kerosene that someone had poured along the foundation. The heat was savage. Townspeople were running with buckets from the horse trough. Sheriff Briggs was inside. Penelope did not think. She ran to the front door, which was not yet burning, and threw it open. Smoke billowed out in a wall of gray. Inside, she could hear coughing, the crash of timber, the roar of flame. Briggs emerged first, half-dragging Austin, both men blackened with soot and gasping for air. Austin's left arm was burned, the sleeve of his shirt charred away, the skin beneath raw and blistered. Briggs collapsed on the boardwalk, coughing blood. Penelope dropped to her knees beside Austin and pulled him into her arms. She did not think about who was watching, did not think about propriety or reputation or the careful distance she had maintained for 5 months. She just held him, right there in the street, in front of the whole town, and the ice inside her cracked from top to bottom and fell away. On the brick wall beside the burning jail, someone had painted in red letters, "Killers do not deserve a trial." Austin Jennings lay on the floor of Morrison's ranch house with bandages wrapped around his burned arm, thinking about the strangest thing. Not the fire, not the pain, not the fact that someone had tried to burn him alive in a county jail. He was thinking about the moment Penelope had run through the smoke and pulled him into her arms in front of the entire town, not caring who saw, not caring what it meant. That was the moment when he knew. Morrison had brought Austin back to the ranch under his own authority, with Briggs's grudging consent. The jail was a ruin. There was nowhere else to hold a prisoner. And Briggs, whose building had just been burned by the men of the man who had asked him to make the arrest, was starting to have serious doubts about whose side justice was on. "You are technically in my custody," Morrison told Austin, standing over him with a cup of coffee. "Try not to make me look bad." Sheriff Briggs arrived at the ranch that morning with his own questions. The fire had changed him. He had been lazy, yes. Negligent, certainly. He had taken Holloway's whiskey and called Thomas Edwards's death an accident, without looking too hard, because looking too hard was effort, and effort was not Cal Briggs's strength. But someone had burned his jail. That was personal. That was an attack on the law he represented, flawed as his representation of it had been. "I want to know everything," Briggs said, sitting at Morrison's kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had not touched. From the beginning, they told him. Morrison, Austin, and Penelope, who had ridden out at dawn with circles under her eyes and fire in them. They laid out the letters from the investigator, the bank receipt, Thomas's letter, the bullet. They told him about Holloway and his father, about the warrant, about the debt, about the assassination. Briggs listened. He was quiet for a long time when they finished. Then he said, "You are asking me to believe that the richest man in town murdered his own father, framed an innocent man, and had a young husband shot to death on his wedding night. Over land and money, and the fact that nobody ever told him no," Morrison said. "That is what men like Holloway are. They do not stop until someone stops them." "I need proof," Briggs said. "Hard proof. Not letters from a San Francisco detective. Something I can take to a judge." Penelope looked at Austin. Austin looked at Penelope. And she said the thing she had been thinking since the fire. "I know where to find it. The hotel room, Holloway's suite on the second floor." Penelope had watched his patterns for 2 weeks now during the time she was playing the naive widow. She knew he left every morning at 9 to ride out to the properties he was supposedly evaluating for purchase. He was usually gone until early afternoon. Dawson went with him. Mackey stayed behind but spent his mornings in the saloon. The room would be empty for at least 3 hours. Rosa went with her as lookout. They climbed the back stairs of the hotel while Mackie was on his second whiskey at the saloon across the street. Rosa stood at the top of the stairs watching both directions, while Penelope slipped into Holloway's room. She searched with the methodical focus of a woman who understood exactly what she was looking for. She went through the desk first, then the dresser, then the trunk at the foot of the bed. She found what she needed in a leather portfolio tucked beneath a false bottom in the trunk. Letters in Holloway's handwriting to a lawyer in Trinidad, discussing the Edwards property and the obstacles to acquisition. A ledger with dates and amounts, including payments to a C. Dawson that corresponded with the week Thomas was killed. And a set of documents in Spanish, old Mexican-era land deeds that predated the American acquisition of California, that Holloway had clearly obtained but could not fully read. Penelope could read them. Her mother, who was of California descent, had taught her Spanish as a child. She scanned the deeds quickly and found what mattered. The original land grant, dated 1841, showed a parcel in Sonoma County that matched the property Thomas had inherited. The chain of ownership was unbroken. The land was legally Penelope's. She was about to leave when she saw something else. A small leather pouch on the nightstand beside the bed that Dawson was apparently using. She opened it and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. A gold ring. A man's wedding band, simple with an inscription on the inside. T and P forever. Thomas and Penelope. She had wondered what happened to Thomas's ring. When they prepared his body for burial, the ring was gone. She had assumed it was lost in the chaos, fallen beneath the hotel bed, swept away. She had grieved its absence as one more small cruelty in a long list of cruelties. It was here, in Kurt Dawson's possession, a trophy, a souvenir from a job well done. Penelope slid the ring onto her thumb. It was too big for her fingers. She tucked the documents into her dress and walked out of the room. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were bone dry. She brought everything to Morrison's ranch. The documents were spread on the kitchen table. The investigator from San Francisco, Albert Worth, arrived that afternoon, having received Henderson's urgent letter by fast rider 3 days earlier. He confirmed the paper trail. The picture was complete. Garrett Holloway had killed his own father and staged it to look like a crime. Then framed Austin Jennings because Austin, as deputy sheriff, had been the one asking uncomfortable questions about the death. Holloway had seized the Jennings family land through fraud. Then he had tracked Austin west, and when he discovered Austin was in Petaluma, he realized he could eliminate both the witness to his father's murder and the heir to the Edwards land in one operation. Kurt Dawson had been sent to Petaluma months before Holloway arrived. He was the one who fired the shot that killed Thomas Edwards on his wedding night. Not a stray bullet. A calculated assassination from the building across the street from the hotel, using a .44-40 Winchester rifle. Everything Penelope had lost. Every day of frozen numbness. Every night staring at the ceiling. Every moment of that terrible ice that had encased her for 5 months. It all traced back to one man's greed. They moved that afternoon. Morrison, Briggs, Austin with his burned arm wrapped in fresh bandages, Penelope, and 4 of Morrison's vaqueros. They found Holloway at the hotel, packing. He had seen the investigators arrive and understood that the game was ending. When the group confronted him in the hotel lobby, Holloway's polished exterior cracked for just a moment. He looked at Penelope and at Austin standing beside her and at the documents in Briggs's hands, and he knew. But Garrett Holloway was not the kind of man who surrendered quietly. He nodded to Dawson, and what happened next happened very fast. Dawson drew his pistol and fired at Austin. The shot went wide, hitting the hotel door frame, because Dawson was drawing with his non-dominant hand. His right hand, Penelope would later learn, had been injured in a bar fight years ago and never healed properly. Austin threw himself sideways. Morrison pulled his rifle. The vaqueros scattered for cover. Penelope was standing on the store's boardwalk across the street, having been told by Morrison to stay out of the line of fire. She had Thomas's Colt in her hand. She had taken it from the nightstand drawer that morning and loaded it, and the weight of it was different now. Not the weight of a last exit, the weight of a weapon held by a woman who knew how to use it. Dawson steadied himself and aimed at Austin again. This time he would not miss. Penelope raised the Colt. She brought the barrel up to chest height, exactly the way Austin had told her that day in the store when he found her holding the shotgun. She squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit Dawson's gun hand. He screamed and dropped the pistol. It clattered on the boardwalk and slid into the street. As Dawson fell to his knees, clutching his ruined hand, Penelope noticed something. His other hand, the uninjured one, was missing a finger. The ring finger. The finger that would have worn a wedding band. She looked down at Thomas's ring on her own thumb, then at Dawson's mutilated hand, and she understood. He had taken the ring from Thomas's dead hand and could not get it off his own finger when it no longer fit. So he had done what men like him did. He solved the problem with a knife. Holloway tried to run. He got as far as the stagecoach before Briggs caught him. The horses spooked when Briggs fired a warning shot, and the coach overturned at the edge of town, spilling Holloway into the dirt. Briggs hauled him up by the collar and put him in irons. Mackey surrendered without a fight. He had always been the smart one. The quiet came after. The terrible, beautiful quiet that follows violence, when the dust settles and the smoke clears and the world rearranges itself around the new reality. Austin and Penelope stood in the general store, alone. The Colt lay on the counter between them, still warm. Austin looked at the gun she had once pressed to her own temple, the gun that had just saved his life. "You brought the barrel up to chest height," he said, "just like I told you." Penelope looked at him, and she laughed. It came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been locked and sealed and frozen for so long that the sound of it surprised her as much as it surprised him. A real laugh. The first genuine laugh she had made since Thomas was alive. Austin smiled. It was the smile she had seen in glimpses, the slow, warm smile that transformed his weathered face into something she could look at for the rest of her life. That night, alone in her room, Penelope opened the nightstand drawer. She took out the Colt. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the history of it. Then she opened the cylinder and removed the remaining bullets one by one. She did not need her last exit anymore. She set the final bullet on the table. It rolled slowly across the wood, glinting in the lamplight, and came to rest against the gray wool gloves. May of 1880. The piece of land Thomas Edwards never got the chance to tell her about was where Penelope stood now, facing east, where the sun was rising over the greenest hills she had ever seen. Sonoma Valley spread below her in waves of emerald and gold, dotted with cattle, and threaded with creeks that glinted silver in the morning light. The Pacific Ocean was a blue line at the edge of the world. Austin stood beside her, his hand holding hers, and for the first time neither of them was afraid of what came next. The legal proceedings had taken weeks. A territorial judge from Sacramento, a man Morrison had served with during the war, came to Petaluma and heard the case. Austin was fully exonerated. The wanted circular was voided. His name was cleared. Garrett Holloway was indicted on charges that would follow him for the rest of his life. The murder of his father was a Colorado matter, and the California court arranged for transfer of that charge to the authorities in Trinidad. The conspiracy to murder Thomas Edwards, the arson of the county jail, the fraud and attempted land seizure were California charges that would be tried in the state courts. Kurt Dawson, broken hand and all, confessed to firing the shot that killed Thomas Edwards. He was remanded to the county sheriff and would eventually be transported to the state prison at San Quentin to await trial. Penelope sat through the testimony without crying. She had cried enough. She held Austin's hand through all of it, through Dawson's flat recitation of how he had been paid $300 to kill a man on his wedding night, through the reading of Holloway's letters that treated murder as a line item in a business ledger, through the moment when the judge looked at Holloway and said the words that Penelope had waited 2 years to hear. "Garrett Holloway, you will stand trial for your crimes, and may God have mercy on your soul because the evidence suggests you have none." When it was over, Penelope went back to Thomas's grave. She had not been there since September, since the day this story began. Austin came with her. He did not ask if she wanted him there. He simply walked beside her the way he had walked beside her mule on that moonlit night, present without presuming. When they reached the cemetery, he stopped several paces behind her, giving her space without being asked. Penelope knelt at the headstone. She traced the letters of Thomas's name with her finger. Then she reached into her pocket and placed something on the stone. A peppermint stick. She had asked Austin about them the day before on the ride back from the courthouse. Why 3? Why every week? Why peppermint? And he had told her. About Danny, his youngest brother, 12 years old when the fever took him, who had loved peppermint candy more than anything in the world. About how buying 3 sticks at every town was Austin's way of carrying Danny forward, of refusing to let the dead stay dead as long as there was someone alive to remember them. Penelope had listened and understood, and she had chosen this as her offering. Not flowers, not prayers. A peppermint stick. The currency of grief that Austin had taught her, the stubborn act of honoring the dead by refusing to stop living. She spoke quietly to the headstone. I found out who did it, Thomas. And I found someone worth living for. I think you would have liked him. He is patient the way you were, and he buys candy for ghosts. She stood and brushed the dirt from her knees. She looked at the sky, at the green hills, at the town below. Then she walked back to Austin and took his arm. They walked back to town together. The wedding was small, simple, held in Petaluma's white clapboard church on a Saturday afternoon in May. Mrs. Henderson, recovered enough to stand with the help of a cane, served as Penelope's witness. Hank Morrison stood for Austin. Rosa carried wildflowers she had picked from the hills that morning. The vaqueros played guitar on the church steps. Penelope wore a simple cream-colored dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her choose from the store's fabric stock. On her hands, she wore the gray wool gloves despite the May warmth because they were the first thing Austin had ever given her. The minister read the words. When he reached the part where he asked if she took this man to be her husband, Penelope froze. It came without warning. The ice returned, not the calculated coldness of the past 2 years, but something older and raw. Terror. Pure animal terror. She was standing in a church about to marry a man, and the last time she had done this, she was a widow 4 hours later. Thomas had been alive and laughing at this same point in the ceremony, and then he was dead, and the world had taught her with absolute clarity that happiness was just the setup for devastation. Her vision narrowed. Her breath stopped. The church went silent. Everyone was looking at her. Mrs. Henderson with concern, Rosa with understanding, Morrison with the patience of a man who had seen soldiers freeze under fire and knew better than to rush them. Austin did not touch her, did not speak, did not reach for her hand or try to pull her out of it. He just stood there, steady and calm, the way he had stood in the breaking pen with the wild Mustang, waiting for the panic to burn itself out. And Penelope saved herself. She looked down at the gloves on her hands. Gray wool, fingerless, practical. Given without expectation, kept without obligation. She thought about every choice she had made since the day Austin left them on the counter, every crack in the ice, every step forward. She had made those choices. No one had carried her. No one had dragged her back from the edge. She had chosen again and again to try, and she chose now. I choose you, she said. Her voice was clear, steady, a voice that had walked through fire and come out the other side still standing. I choose you today and tomorrow, and every day I have to choose again. Austin's eyes were bright. His voice was rough with everything he could not say in a church full of people. And I promise to keep being worth choosing. The minister pronounced them married. Austin kissed her softly. Rosa cried. Morrison blew his nose into a handkerchief the size of a horse blanket. Mrs. Henderson smiled the way only a woman who has lost a husband and watched another woman nearly die of the same wound can smile, with joy that is indistinguishable from grief. After the ceremony, Austin took Penelope's hand and led her away from the well-wishers and the guitar music and the laughter. They rode together to the piece of land that Thomas had inherited and that Penelope now owned. They stood on the hilltop and looked down at the valley. "What do you want to do with it?" Austin asked. Penelope thought for a long time. The wind moved through the grass. A red-tailed hawk circled above them, riding the thermals. "Build a house," she said. "Raise cattle. Live here." Then, softer, Thomas would have liked that. He always wanted a ranch. That was the moment she reconciled with everything. Not forgetting Thomas, not replacing him, just letting his memory become part of the story instead of the end of it. That night, in Morrison's cabin, where they would stay until the house was built, Penelope stood by the window. It was dark outside, the Sonoma Hills black against a sky full of stars. She could see her own reflection in the glass, and behind her the warm glow of the fireplace where Austin was adding another log. She remembered another wedding night, another window, Thomas standing right where she was standing now, silhouetted against the glass, and then the crack of a rifle and the shattering of everything. The fear hit her like a fist. Her body went rigid. Her hands gripped the windowsill until her knuckles turned white. Austin saw it. He did not go to the window, did not cross the room. He sat down by the fireplace in the safest spot in the room away from any window, and said 2 words. "Come here, Penny," the first time he had ever called her that. The intimate name. The name that meant he saw all of her, the ice and the fire and the scars, and wanted her anyway. Penelope looked at the window. She looked at Austin, sitting by the fire with his burned arm and his patient eyes and his peppermint stick grief and his quiet, stubborn kindness. She looked back at the window where Thomas had died. Then she left the window and sat beside Austin on the floor. He put his arm around her and pulled her close and said nothing else, just held her. And in his arms the fear did not vanish. It did not melt dramatically away like ice in a storybook. It shrank. It became smaller, bearable, something she could carry. She would not always be brave. There would be nights she woke from dreams of shattering glass. Days the grief rose up and threatened to pull her under. Moments when the old ice called to her, promising the safety of feeling nothing at all. But she would not face them alone. That was the difference Austin had made. Not by saving her because he had not saved her. She had saved herself. He had just kept showing up, kept being kind, kept proving through 100 small acts that the world still held goodness in it, until she remembered that she was strong enough to reach for it. Something fell softly from Austin's shirt pocket as he shifted his weight. A peppermint stick. It rolled across the floorboards and came to rest against her bare foot. Penelope picked it up. She held it to the firelight. Red and white, twisted together. 3 for Danny, Austin said quietly. He buys them at every town. 3 for the dead. She looked at the candy in her hand, then at Austin. "But this is the 4th one," she said. Austin did not answer right away. He looked at the fire, at the ceiling, at his hands. Then he looked at her. "First time I ever bought a 4th, he said. "The other 3 are for remembering. That one is for starting over." Penelope held the peppermint stick and felt tears rising, but did not fight them. She had fought tears for 2 years, and she was done fighting. The tears came, and they were warm, and they did not destroy her. They just moved through her like weather, like seasons, like the natural cycle of a heart that was learning to feel again after a long and brutal winter. Outside the window, the Sonoma wind carried the smell of spring grass and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Somewhere a coyote called and another answered. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of the people below, but beautiful nonetheless. Penelope closed her eyes. She leaned back against Austin's chest and listened to his heartbeat. Steady, patient, unhurried, exactly the way he had loved her from the beginning. And her heart. The one that had frozen too long cracked, thawed, nearly shattered again, beat in time with his. Not because it was fully healed, not because the scars were gone or the grief had vanished or the fear had been conquered forever, but because it was finally warm enough to keep beating. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.